This tutorial is going to walk through this pedigree analysis problem. If you haven't looked it over recently, take a minute now to pause the video and read the problem, then come back to see how we're going to approach it. In order to analyze pedigrees, it's important to be able to interpret the information that you're given. So first, let's review the meanings of the various symbols that we use in pedigrees in Bio E1A. Circles indicate females and squares males. Individuals whose symbols are filled in are affected by whatever trait you're studying, and those whose symbols are outlines are unaffected. Individuals who are unborn and about whom you don't have any information are shown as diamond outlines. When we look at the relationships between people, horizontal lines that directly connect two individuals indicate marriages or reproductive partners. In families where inbreeding has occurred, we highlight marriages or pregnancies where the partners share one or more ancestors with double lines. Vertical lines represent generations, so children are represented by vertical lines extending from the connection between their biological parents. Siblings branch out from the same shared vertical line. Identical twins' shared conception is indicated by a short vertical line before the branch. Now let's go back to the question. In part A, we need to decide if this trait is dominant or recessive. If a trait is dominant, it means that individuals with at least one copy of the affected allele will exhibit the trait. If a trait is recessive, it means that individuals must possess only the affected allele in order to exhibit the trait. When we look at these different kinds of traits in pedigrees, for dominant traits, affected individuals cannot come from unaffected parents, meaning that an affected individual must have at least one affected parent. In contrast, for recessive traits, affected individuals may or may not have affected parents. If both parents are heterozygous, they will not exhibit the trait, so they won't be affected, but their children could inherit an affected allele from each parent and so be affected. In this pedigree, we have two affected individuals. Both affected individuals have unaffected parents, therefore the trait must be recessive. Both parents of each affected individual must be carriers or heterozygous for the trait, which is about to become important as we move on to the next part of the question. Next, we want to know the probability that a child of A and B will display the trait. Since the trait is recessive, question mark must be homozygous for the allele that is associated with the trait. In order for this to happen, A and B must both possess the affected allele, so both A and B must be heterozygous. So now, let's see what the chances of this are. I find this easiest to calculate by labeling the pedigree with genotype information for people as I work it out, so let's start there. Let big A be unaffected and little a be affected. In order for an individual to be affected, they have to be homozygous little a. So these two individuals are both homozygous. Their parents are all unaffected, but have affected children, so they must all be heterozygous, so that they can pass on the little a allele without being affected themselves. Then, we know that individuals marrying into the pedigree are homozygous unaffected, so they must all be big A. At this point, we're out of people whose genotypes we can say for sure, and we haven't figured out the probability that A and B are heterozygous yet. So let's look at how they could be heterozygous. Since all of their ancestors who married into the family could only contribute big A alleles, the little a allele would have to be passed down through the pedigree from one of the original heterozygous individuals, indicated here now in green. On the left side, the little a allele would have to be passed down through 3 generations to individual A, and on the right, it would have to be passed down through 2 generations to individual B. At each generation, there is some probability that the little a allele will be passed on. That's what we need to calculate. Let's start with this individual here. What is the probability that she is big A little a? Well, we know that her parents are both heterozygous, so we can set up our Punnett square like this, and recognize that overall, she will be big A little a 50% of the time. But that's only the case if we have no other information. In this case, we do have other information. We know that she's not affected, so there's no way that she could be little a, and we can discount that option. So there's a 2/3 probability that she'll be big A little a instead of 1/2. The same is true of this guy over here. Unaffected individual, 2 heterozygous parents. The probability that he's heterozygous is also going to be 2/3. And if he's heterozygous, the probability that he passes on the little a allele to individual B is 1/2. Given that his partner is definitely big A, the probability that their son, individual B, is big A little a is therefore 1/2. And if we go back to the left side of the pedigree, if this guy's parents were big A and big A little a, then the probability that he's heterozygous is 1/2. Same thing for individual A. If her parents are big A and heterozygous, the probability that she is big A little a is 1/2. So in order for A to be heterozygous, all of the following must be true. This individual must be heterozygous. This individual too. And A must inherit the little a allele from her father. In order for B to be heterozygous, this guy must be heterozygous, and he must pass the little a allele down to B. So in order for A and B to be heterozygous, all of these things need to happen. This means that to calculate the probability that A and B are both heterozygous, we take the individual probabilities of each of these things and multiply them all together using the product rule. So we have the probabilities that we need to have A be heterozygous, and the probabilities that we need to have B be heterozygous, multiplied together to give us the overall probability that both A and B are heterozygous, which is 1/18. And if A and B are both heterozygous, the probability that they will have a homozygous affected child is 1/4. So the overall probability that question mark will be affected is 1/18 times 1/4, or 1/72. And there you go. Check out the practice problems for more examples, or make up your own and test yourself.